for the record, our team was third place. And I like the slingshot sort of, that's like a weapon almost, you know, a trebuchet, yeah. I was trying to remember, trebuchet was what I was trying to remember, and I was like, I remember one of my kids, like in 5th grade, doing the trebuchet project, and I was like, if I could just remember the answer. And I knew it was something about triangles, and of course you see our valiant attempt over there, although we were third place. So really, I mean, again, thanks for everybody for inviting me to speak. And it's really on behalf of my boss, Lieutenant General Brown, who's actually away this weekend. And what he asked me to talk about a little bit is kind of some of the work that we've been doing on behalf of the Army for human dimension, specifically kind of where we're at currently. And we don't have all the answers. Matter of fact, I think one of my props over there is our current strategy, which says draft version 4 or 5, right? 5.4. Now we're doing that. We don't have all the answers on it, and it's really sort of one of these things where sort of your thoughts and ideas, I mean, intuitively you can all understand the importance of people, especially whether it's sort of military or corporate life. And I mean, from my background, certainly in the Army, not having been one of these in organizations that was focused on material. I've never been in one of these organizations where it's been about a tank, an artillery piece, or some sort or a helicopter. I've been one of these guys where it's been really about the people in the organizations that I've been. My perspective, although I'm not sure it's terribly different from others, it's kind of really what I've grown up with. Is it's how do we enable our people, our soldiers, or whomever you are, regardless of branch of service, to really certainly be optimized to accomplish the tasks that our country needs to do. And so it's not my idea. You know, there's a number of sort of strategic planning documents that have directed, implied, inferred the necessity of investing in our people for sort of the current and future complexity that our world's in. So on behalf of the Army, within the Training and Doctrine Command, really General Brown, who's kind of had a lifetime of doing this, you know, for those of you that know him, I mean, you know, he was a basketball player, played for Coach K. Sort of the mark that he leaves on organizations in the Army is really the development of people, the development of leaders. And for any of you that have served or followed with him, you know that this is sort of one of these things that he's kind of always done. And so our current endeavors really for the Army is to kind of move this thing forward in ways that it has not gone before. Been a number of efforts with varying degrees of success, probably in the 239-year pilot program that we've been running in the United States Army on how to develop leaders and optimize soldier performance. And I think, you know, like anything, I mean, the part that I appreciate about, you know, being in the military is I think we tend to be very critical of ourselves, which is good because we really are a great organization. But even though we can be critical of ourselves and look for ways to improve, we don't always enact change. I mean, we can look in the mirror and go, yeah, you need to shave better, comb your hair differently. But then what do we do about it to change? So this is sort of our effort to sort of drive this change to invest in people for a certainly increasing complex world. So, of course, you know, in the Army, we've got to have a multimedia presentation. So I'm going to attempt to allow you to see some of this. You know, picture's worth 1,000 words. Probably a short video clip is worth, you know, 10,000. So I'm going to do that here very quickly. So Kurt, if you could roll the video real quick. And then I'm going to pause at different opportunities to sort of allow you to kind of continue to inject your thoughts and ideas, not so that we get totally derailed, but, you know, it's probably more important that we kind of capture the ideas and thoughts and answer questions rather than complete, you know, a 9-page or 9-chart brief. So go ahead, Kurt, if you're ready. I'll just step out.
Despite advances in technology, war remains a human contest of wills. This contest will only intensify as the Russian increases and the spaces between groups diminish. No one can predict where the next challenge to American interests will emerge, only that it will appear suddenly from an unexpected direction and require rapid adaptation to address. In a future marked by diminishing advantage and growing uncertainty, the Army must focus its investment in its most agile asset, its people. The world is becoming increasingly complex. The increased rate of human interaction, driven by the rapid diffusion of information, leads to sudden, unexpected, emergent behavior in societies often grounded in ancient grievances. The technological edge that the United States military has enjoyed since the ending of World War II is eroding. The rapid pace of commercial innovation in the 21st century provides great opportunities for potential adversaries to achieve short-term military advantage in niche capabilities. A sustained investment in the human dimension of combat power is the most reliable insurance against an uncertain future. In the past, soldiers and civilians were trained to excel in known fields of tactical and technical competence. While these competencies remain important, the increasing uncertainty of the future environment will require cohesive teams of trusted professionals who are not just comfortable with ambiguity and chaos, but improve and thrive in it. In a world of near constant surveillance, leaders must also be able to appreciate strategic context, always prepared for global scrutiny of the smallest tactical actions. Army leaders at every level must think broadly about the nature of the conflict, display a nuanced sense of social context, and develop creative solutions to complex problems in a timely manner. Army teams of trusted professionals must be able to innovate rapidly, especially in the face of complexity and ambiguity. This will require an ethos of disruptive innovation, a bias toward action, and a culture of trust empowered by mission command. Producing these teams in the face of decreasing physical resources and a diminished recruiting pool will require a concerted effort in the science of human performance optimization. The Army must apply emerging advances in learning sciences and predictive analytics to ensure the optimal development and best utilization of our talent. This will require investment to fully develop the knowledge, skills, and attributes of every soldier and civilian to reach their unique potential. The education, training, and leader development systems we have today are not adequately equipped to produce the Army professionals that we require for tomorrow. Producing these professionals demands a comprehensive human dimension strategy, simultaneously oriented on the individual, the team, and the institution. This strategy includes three major lines of effort. Dominance describes all efforts that equip soldiers and civilians with the cognitive, physical, and social capabilities to dominate any situation or adversary. The second line of effort, realistic training, focuses on the process of building cohesive teams through demanding training that fully replicates the complexity of the future environment. The third and final line of effort, institutional agility, seeks to build the capability for our systems and processes to adapt rapidly to changing situations, seize opportunities, and field innovative solutions in advance of need, while maintaining the Army as a profession. Adapting to face novel threats and thriving in the midst of the chaos brought by these threats will be the abiding challenges in the Army's future. Together, these three lines of effort define the scope and orientation of the Army's human dimension strategy and outline a road ahead to meet the challenging demands of the future.
Okay, so what are your questions? No, I'll probably go in a little bit more, but I think, you know, what the video does, I mean, we tend to learn best when we have sort of multimedia ways to do it. So the voice over the images are pretty powerful, I think, and they do a good job at describing certainly our complex world. But if you'll go to the next slide, Kurt. Yeah. So, I mean, you all watch the news, you read, you know, the world that we are in right now where information moves so much more quickly. Non-state actors, sort of state-sponsored things. I mean, if you, I was in Germany about 3 weeks ago, looking at sort of the things that we are learning from what's going on in Europe with the Russians. And I mean, for those of you that ever experienced the opportunity to understand Soviet doctrine years ago and have kept those manuals, it's certainly worth pulling them out. Because it's this sort of different type of warfare that you can see as you kind of really study and look at what's going on in the Crimea, what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, you literally have, you know, a tank company commander with maybe 60 soldiers up there in Estonia within kilometers of the Russian army looking at each other. It's almost like we've gone back to where we were sort of in 1989 prior to the wall coming down. But it's this sort of, I'm not really sure it's a new warfare, but it's a type of warfare that we're seeing, not just in the Ukraine and with what the Russians are doing. You've got the Islamic State, you've got other insurgency state and non-state actors. You know, you look at what some of the sort of proxy organizations are doing in the Middle East. I mean, it's a pretty complex world right now. And, you know, a new helicopter, a new tank, a new Bradley, a new Intel sensor is not going to solve the problem. I mean, when you look at, and there's been some great work done on this idea of megacities, these huge metropolises that are much greater than any sort of military capacity involved. So if you say, let's say we got 100,000 person metropolis or megacity, 99% are great and wonderful people that support the host nation government, but 1% are bad or evil or disloyal to the government. So the beer math on that is 1% of what? What did I say? 100 million or whatever? I mean, that's 1 million people, right? Or 1 million? Yeah, my beer math is up. Yeah, 100,000 for 10 million. That's a lot of bad people. And so our ability to sort of respond in these complex environments is not going to necessarily be a material solution, although there's certainly material ideas that can certainly help. It's really an investment in our people. And I think, you know, although we've done that throughout the years, the necessity for it is increasingly imperative. We do it very well with sort of niche capabilities with our special operations forces. And this is not to say that, you know, we need to create a military of people with that, because we probably don't have the capacity in terms of the right people to do it, but also the resources. And there's a unique role for special operations forces. But it's the ability to sort of not maximize, but optimize what we have. I mean, if you think about it in terms of your car, you can maximize the speed of your car if you go into that red zone, right? In terms of your RPMs. But how long can you do that? Well, it depends on your car. I mean, I got a 15-year-old truck. I can't do that very long. But eventually, that maximization of what you can get out of your car is going to result in engine failure, right? But what we want to do is optimize it, right? We want to get the most out of it that we absolutely can without sort of redlining. And for all of us, it's probably a little bit different. And so sort of the things that we encounter in the world right now require us to really look at how we do that for our people. So as the video said, we've really kind of looked at that through 3 lines of effort. And it, you know, obviously it's open for debate and discussion, but really through a sort of inclusive environment within sort of at least the Army on this, as well as some ideas from academia. We kind of broke it down into 3 lines of effort: a cognitive dominance one, a realistic training, which most of you say, well, geez, we've been in the military, we think we do that, and we've done that for quite a while. There's probably ways that we can improve. And then institutional agility. And so, you know, although we could talk about it for, that's kind of how we broke it down. Go ahead to the next chart, please, Kurt. So, you know, when you look at that, again, we talk about the ability to improve and thrive in ambiguity and chaos. There's a lot of adjectives that people use. We talk about adapting to complexity or change, and that's probably okay. But to me, adaptation is sort of a reactive response. And although that's way better than not adapting, of course, what we want is to be a little bit more agile. I think agility, when you look at it, certainly in a military perspective, if you looked at it and said, okay, I can see something coming, and so I'll apply sort of an intellectual and organizational sort of nimbling and then adjust. But what we really want to be able to do is kind of put people that see the complexity and then thrive in it to achieve that sort of overmatch. And I think when you look at some of our opponents, they don't have the same rules that we do. I mean, they're not bound by law or moral, ethical things. In some cases, they do what they want. And so they can naturally be much more agile to us. They don't know how to play by the rules. So really the problem we're trying to solve is, so how do we adapt as an institution, the individuals, which are really, I'd argue our most powerful weapon is our people. How do we adapt them to thrive in sort of this ambiguity and chaos? And there's a plethora of examples of where we have not done that very well, or where our moral and professional underpinnings have failed us. And so that idea of, that we talk the strategic corporal. We tend to look at that I think it's an unfair generalization where we say the person that does the oopsie or makes a mistake or has a moral or ethical breach that instead of being just seen by a few in an isolated incident is now magnified in this information world. It's seen by everybody. The strategic corporal can do the same, except in a good way. And I mean, some of that is, how does the word get out? But what we want to do is make that young, and here's the, as a young second lieutenant, my very first thing that I did was 6 months in the Sinai as a peacekeeping mission. And the task there was very simple. It was to observe and report violations of the Dayton Accords. And so it was a lot of looking through binoculars, looking at the sky, looking at the land, looking at the water. And my location was right up on the Egyptian-Israeli border. So there was a lot of stuff to describe and report. I mean, we were busy. People in the other parts of the peninsula, down by the Straits of Tiran, it was a little bit more slow. But we always had something. And this was, probably your greatest threat personally as an organization or as a soldier was stepping on a landmine that had moved around over the years of conflict. So we had plenty of things to observe and report, and you'd see things all the time, and you send up the report. But it really was not sort of the natural response was observe and report. It was not a threat to your physical well-being. So you weren't, your first instinct was not to fight. It was more to report. There were not a lot of guys that your first response would be to shoot a trigger. Now, how do these are infantrymen now, right? How do you train that response? And so I think it's through repetition and complexity. And so we didn't have problems with that because we were able to rehearse that ahead of time. But we came back, had about 2 weeks of training, and then a month later found ourselves in the invasion of Panama, which, as you know, during those outset days was really about eliminating the Panamanian Defense Force's ability to impact Americans in our way of lives. They had killed some people, they'd arrested some people. So it was a very lethal initial 48 hours, 72 hours, 96 hours, which it was about, a force-on-force fight between American military might and the Panamanian Defense Forces. It was, what we would refer to as sort of a traditional lethal conflict. But intermixed with that in downtown Panama City, very large metropolis, you got people kind of coming and going, doing their daily business. And how would you like to be the guy whose position after the fight ends up being right next to the hospital, the children's hospital? And so in a series of concentric rings leading out from the Santo Thomas Hospital, which, oh, by the way, what's right next to it? The American Embassy. So here you've got probably the remaining target of any form of resistance of the Panamanian Defense Force sitting right next to the children's hospital. So the target of the remaining enemy right next to an area where, guess what? Mothers are taking their hurt children, or mothers are going to have, soon to be mothers, going to have a baby. And what's that normal response that a sort of a man does when it's time to take his wife to the hospital to deliver the baby? He's moving out at a high rate of speed, isn't he? Because the most important thing to him is the welfare of the child. A speeding vehicle moving towards an American military checkpoint is perceived as what? A threat, right? And I mean, you can go back and sort of read instances where maybe that threat resulted in the unfortunate act of killing or wounding some of the local civilians. But what impressed me the most was because of that sort of cognitive preparation that my team had been a part of in let's let's have a cognitive process before we automatically pull the trigger. As a result of that mission in the Sinai, created a degree of discipline, pleased in the performance of our young soldiers, and we didn't have any of those mishaps. And we were the ones right next to it. And so you say, well, why did that happen? Other than great leadership of a lot of great young non-commissioned officers, some of it had to do with the sort of cognitive preparation of why should I pull the trigger? Not everything that you perceive as a threat actually is. And we got to put it in the context of something larger. I'm right next to a hospital. You know, is every person that's speeding towards my little concertina barrier out here a threat? Or are they just taking their wife to the hospital to have a baby? And so it dawned on me then at a very young time in my life, the importance of sort of realistic training and cognitive preparation in terms of how do we create these thoughts. And it's continually been repeated for me, whether it was in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, other good places. It's much more than being able to deliver lethal effects. It's the ability to use your mind. So go ahead and go to the next chart, please. So I'm not going to belabor this because I hope that my example sort of described it. I mean, clearly with some of the threats that we have in the world today, there is a much shorter degree of certainty on how that's going to happen. I mean, if the North Koreans go south, we kind of know how that's going to unfold. There's a couple of mobility corridors. We've studied the land for years. I mean, we pretty much know, other than the uncertainty and friction of combat, we kind of know how that's going to happen. We understand the capabilities of some of our other near peers. And so that's pretty easy. When you look at our air-land battle doctrine, when we thought the Soviets were going to possibly come across what was then the East German border, it was really, we say war is a contest of wills, but in that case, it was to a certain extent a degree of mathematical calculation. We knew that they had overmatch on us in terms of the quantity of what they could deliver in terms of combat power, and we could not meet it. So how do you do it? You generate weapon systems that have increased standoff. You have sort of a defense in depth so that we can delay in enough time that we can mass combat power to defeat them. That's certainly not the environment that we're in today. Incredibly complex. And so as this strategic operational and tactical uncertainty increases, sort of our challenge is to make sure that those people, those young people manning that checkpoint next to the hospital, co-located with the embassy, have the wherewithal both tactically and technically to not only deliver lethal force if necessary, but utilize their sort of cognitive processes in a way that they've been prepared so they can operate in that environment. So that's strategic corporals for good, not necessarily for bad. So the people are really, and could you say it's an offset against a challenging budget environment? Okay, yeah, sure. But that's not the reason for it. I mean, just look at the world today. It's incredibly complex. So go ahead and go to we call this the infamous Atom chart, the Atom Man. Again, kind of going through this sort of iterative, inclusive process to kind of get it right or get close to right. And again, we don't really have all the right answers yet. I mean, that's why we're always interested in more. If the problem we're trying to solve is to optimize the capabilities of our young men and women at echelon that are out there, what are the underlying principles? And I said 3 lines of effort to kind of help solve this. Cognitive dominance, institutional agility, and realistic training. But what is sort of the underlying piece behind that? And you go to the center of that and you see the profession. This one, I sort of self-critique myself on. My father was in the Army, although I had the experience of actually being born at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital while he was going to grad school in Pennsylvania. So I've kind of grown up around it my whole life, and it never dawned on me that there were those amongst us that did not recognize or perceive us as being in a profession. And certainly it's something we've always said. I like to read the 1950s version of The Armed Forces Officer, which I think is a tremendous book, really spawned out of an endeavor by Marshall in the 40s. There's a more current version of it that's under rewrite right now, but that 1950s version really gets at the principles of what being an armed forces officer or a member of the profession of arms means. And so sort of what we kind of found ourselves over the last few years is the necessity to reemphasize the profession, the character, the commitments, and competence as we kind of look at our people. So that is an underlying principle. And then as you can kind of see, operating around that is sort of the idea of agile, adaptive leaders who thrive in chaos, and then these three certain lines of effort. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. So I talked about 3 lines of effort. Realistic training. I think that's one that we've probably foundationally done okay with, but there's a lot of thought, that's been done lately, and it's pretty good work on sort of outcomes-based training. Really, how do we make our training more realistic to get after this complexity? A great example that I think we use, and there's certainly room for foundational task training. I'm not advocating going against that. Master before you can move on. But, if you go to sort of any sort of Army standard marksmanship range right now, and I suspect it's the same in the Marine Corps, there's a couple of types of targets that pop up. One is your classic sort of Soviet military guy, that's like 3 feet tall and pops up at like 2-second intervals. And then there's the sort of, dark silhouette that has, change in numbers. And I mean, I've kind of been in that a few years now. Never once have I seen somebody like pop up and expose themselves for like 2 seconds and down and do it repetitively from the same position, because it's just not a natural human response while being shot at to pop up and go down, pop up and go down. Now, I mean, I say that a little bit in jest because, again, we have to train some foundational principles. But what do we do to add to complexity afterwards? Most of the time, people are operating from behind cover or at a minimum concealment, and they minimize their exposure to you, or they move in sort of predictable ways, up, down, sideways, forward. When you go to a marksmanship range that does that, guess what? You could be the greatest stationary marksman. You're not very good at it. The art of least on his speed and exposure is tremendously complicated. Now, it's very trainable. But when you look at sort of how our training infrastructure supports that, we're not training to that degree of complexity. So, I think, if you had a bulletproof robot, and you could make him zigzag, pop up and down, that would be the really way to do it. So there's obviously room for improvement at above, as well as above the tactical echelon. My examples are very tactical. Operational and strategic complexity. When you talk about dealing with things in the sort of the media, who knows what some of our threats are really thinking? We're not really even talking about the Crimea anymore, are we? We just kind of, and that happened how many months after the great and wonderful Olympics, right? So, the question I ask myself is, was this a deliberate plan or was it circumstance? And if so, it seemingly has been pretty successful. So I think that degree of complexity and the ability to think through these things at multiple echelons is pretty important. But I'm going to talk to you in institutional agility. It's about, this is about making a large bureaucracy, which has its purposes, much more agile. And we could talk for days about this. And I'm going to put that in my suggestion box. 5-day seminar on making large bureaucratic organizations more agile. So I don't want to dwell on that one. It may take longer. Yeah, it'd take longer than that. I contrast that when I was in Afghanistan, like 2002, right? And they had it was the antithesis of bureaucracy. They had absolutely nothing. You go to a minister like I forget, maybe Wardak was one of the ministers. And I forget, you go to one of these guys' office and they didn't even know how to write a letter. Not the idea of writing a letter, but a formal memorandum to do something, let alone have any sort of functioning yet efficient bureaucracy. But we're not going to take that one on. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the cognitive dominance one. Because this one, to me, it kind of gets at my example of people at echelon making the right decisions in a very complex environment. The definition, this is our sort of best bet, and if you have thoughts, we can talk about it, on how do we sort of all encompass what this means. There's a book called Headstrong by Dr. Mike Matthews, who's, although he had some time in the Air Force early on, I think he was a sheriff actually in Missouri, deputy sheriff in Missouri. He's sort of a career military psychologist. His day job is, I think he's on the faculty at West Point right now. He's doing something different this year in a strategic studies group, but I'm not sure it was his idea, but certainly he's penned a book that's very worthy of thought on that. And he describes how people learn and develop the sort of cognitive depth and processes to handle complexity. And I think it's a pretty good primer for what we want to try and do, although we got to kind of expand upon that. And, you know, you got those 3 boxes there where we talk social, cognitive, and physical. I mean, because, for those of you that have been part of any of these studies, we know that your cognitive health as well as your decision-making is a lot dependent on your physical health. I don't have the example entirely right, but so just let me generalize a little bit. I think the empirical data suggests that if you go, and again, it's a little bit different for everybody, if you go maybe like 6 nights with less than 7 hours of sleep, I'm somewhere close to that. On that 7th day, cognitively, you're operating at about a 0.08 level of blood alcohol. Now, we've probably all done that. And, you know, I told that to my son. He's in his last year at West Point. He's like, well, God, I've been drunk for like 4 years. I said, don't tell the commandant that. So there's obviously a time and place for that, because you need to understand how you operate in a degraded mode like that. But when you think about what that means for either short duration or protracted land combat or anything that you're doing that requires sleep, if you're operated degraded like that, what sort of decisions? I mean, we're not doing what's right for our young men and women that are in our charge, but we're not doing what's right for our country. So physical health is a critical aspect of sort of the cognitive and mental health. And then many of the things that we tend to learn the hard way, you know, the importance of, we list cultural awareness. My own sort of bias is, this is my own bias, not how we write it in the paper, is that's way better than ignorance. But what we really got to move more towards is understanding. Because awareness is kind of the things that keeps you from shaking with the wrong hand or showing the heel of your boot. We got to go much greater into the understanding, because that allows you to make the physical connection. It's very similar to this. I mean, you could do today's medium here distributed, and there's a role for it in a distributed way, but it's those sort of interpersonal communications and the ability to connect at a personal level that I believe is much more critical. So that's kind of maybe a Cliff Notes version of what we're doing. Again, we could talk for much more time, and if we need to do that, and sort of when we get to question and answer, we'll do that. But I kind of want to provide one historic example, and there's those in this crowd that are much better historians than me, that I think probably gets at, in a contemporary environment, the sort of thought process and leadership that we want to aspire to. And it's a great example because I think, you know, it comes from a guy that's not a career military man, a guy who was really probably more of an intellectual and academic. And so you think about the ability to thrive in ambiguity and chaos. Here's a person that didn't grow up that way. So maybe he didn't have the biases, you know, that we had. But certainly I think for those of you that have ever studied the Battle of Gettysburg can appreciate the significance of what Joshua Chamberlain did. Go ahead. So, I mean, most of you kind of know the story, and I'm not going to sort of rehash this. But whether it sort of was a critical event in the sort of the actual battle and what the results would have been afterwards is, I mean, in my mind, in my perspective, it certainly was. The outcome would have probably, although I think the outcome would have been the same, you just question at what more cost of human life, and how that would have turned out. So I'm going to just go to a brief clip here real quick that I think demonstrates, certainly in a movie clip, what kind of breaking through biases and investment in human capital can make. Go ahead. Yeah, we got to see the whole clip. It's actually pretty emotional, so if any of you kind of well up a little bit, I'm okay with that.
Survey let me go out. We can't hold them against shine. You know that. So if you don't, they go on by and over the hill and go by the Sir, here they come. We can't run away. If we stay here, we can't shoot. It's fixed bayonets. Let the advantage move downhill. They gotta be tired, Rose. They gotta be close to the end if we are. So fixed bayonets. Ellis, wait, Ellis, you take the left wing, I'll take the right. I want a right wheel forward of the whole regiment. Will you charge? Yes, but here's what we do. We're going to charge swinging down the hill. Just like you pull back the left side of the regiment, now we're going to swing it down. We swing like a dog. We're going to sweep them down the hill as they come up. Understand? Does everybody understand? Yes, sir. Ellis, you take the left wing. When I give the command, I want the whole regiment to go forward, being down.
Yeah, if you think about that, and we all have different experiences, so Joshua Chamberlain knew most of these men. He was, from Maine. These were people that he kind of, if he didn't grow up with, they were certainly from the same state. And so, I think his intention was probably to end up back there after the war. And that's kind of what he did. And he had a great career. But you think about, not just the bravery and the valor, but sort of the intellectual thought that went in to really if you think about it, to just fix a bayonet and lead a large number of men down a hill into a stationary enemy, a somewhat stationary enemy. But he understood the importance that it meant to hold that ground. And so that sort of decision that he made, really to me, he had a very good outcome, at least in terms of the tide of the battle there at Gettysburg. But how do we develop guys like him? Again, we've run a 239-year program. And so we shouldn't criticize ourselves so much, but the world is changing around us and we cannot settle for where we're at now. We've got to look for change and say, how do we continuously adapt? So I think a little more contemporary example is the next guy. And, please excuse me, there's two bayonet examples. All right. I'm an infantryman by background. But to me, it really kind of gets at, when you talk about sort of the raw emotion and what it takes to lead people in ground combat, because that's what I do in the Army. These examples do it. And it's a little more contemporary. We Were Soldiers Once When We Were Young, both the movie and the book, written by Hal Moore, about really sort of what was one of our first major conflicts in Vietnam. Major battles, the Battle of the Ia, which you can watch the movie afterwards. I'm not going to hit you with another clip. But Rick Rescorla, this is the cover of the book. He was a platoon leader. He had been, it's actually a pretty neat story. It's worth reading about. He's actually British by background. He became a British para, did time in Africa in the Rhodesian police. How it was kind of all blended together. But basically he was over there. He had a passion, a zeal for fighting communists. So when his tour was done in Africa, the only other way he could figure out how to fight communists was join the American Army. He had a friend named Dan Hill that helped him do that. Was join the American Army, so he became a lieutenant in this sort of experiment. Again, this is the experiment, the idea of something new that's captured in the book. We are going to take a cavalry unit and we're going to insert it by helicopter. And sort of this new idea, a new way of fighting that, is laid out very well in the book. And I think provides great examples of realistic training, but also sort of how to fight the institution and adapt. So Rick Rescorla, this is a picture of him. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm pretty sure I'm close to accurate on that, is preparing to lead a charge of his platoon to rescue the lost platoon, which, was this platoon that had basically taken a little bit too much initiative, And again, I think it goes back to the idea of, do we have a common understanding? Do we have shared? Did he take too much? This guy took a little bit too much risk. It wasn't prudent risk. And this platoon basically isolated themselves. So despite what they wanted to do there in the Battle of Elzey X-ray, they had a platoon that was on the cusp of getting run over. So he had to lead a charge to basically rescue them. And as you know, reading the book or whatever, they got to him, but it wasn't without a lot of loss of life and wounded. But, this is what characterized him through the rest of his career, rest of his life. The way the story ends, for those of you who don't know him, this guy was at Morgan Stanley. He ended up with Morgan Stanley. It was Morgan Stanley, not JP. Yeah, Morgan Stanley. And he worked for Morgan Stanley in the World Trade Centers. And he was kind of their chief of security. And after they saw some of these initial terrorist attempts, this guy basically got pretty motivated and said, you know what? I can see how someday somebody would like to try and blow this thing up and fly a plane into the World Trade Centers. And so he became very dogmatic in his insistence to the leadership and executives of Morgan Stanley that we have got to rehearse those things that we need as an organization to guarantee the welfare of our people when somebody flies an airplane into this building. Well, of course, the executives are, hey, come on, man, I can't afford to do this fire drill. We're here to work and make money, right? but he insisted on it, probably to the point of unpopularity. But he did it. And on 9/11, when those planes went in, he knew exactly what happened. At least that's what everybody believes. I mean, and he immediately sent it into action with bullhorn, cell phone, word of mouth, evacuating all the Morgan Stanley employees. And guess what? I think it's 100% that all of them got out. It was a number short, just below 2,700. So it was because of his ability to kind of think through problems and challenges, have the sort of personal bravery, and then not be afraid to speak truth to power and insist in his belief, that made a difference to really 2,700 lives directly. And you think about exponentially how many lives that made a difference for. Of course, you know how the story ended for him. He was heading upstairs and he never came down. Because after he got his people out, he went after everybody else. So how do we create the Rick Restorless and the Josh Chamberlains? That's what this is all about. I mean, these are normal men. I mean, Rick had a, very auspicious, non-auspicious upbringing. And same with, Joshua Chamberlain was a teacher. Wasn't he? He was a English teacher, right? I think. So how do we create those? And that's really sort of the idea that we're trying to get after on this human dimension piece is adapting our individuals, adapting our systems and processes to become much more agile as an institution, to invest in the people, as well as provide those sort of processes and resources to train realistically. Now, for those of you that want to read the entire human dimension strategy, what are we up to, 35, 36 pages maybe?
20 pages.
20 pages. It's a real page turner, and I'm sure Kurt can give it to you, but we certainly would be interested in feedback. It obviously breaks down sort of what I glossed over in much more detail. So within each line of effort, there's multiple key tasks, and then there's subordinate, or there's objectives, and then there's subordinate key tasks that get after them. So to me, sort of one of the big, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, and then we'll just go to questions. One of the sort of the elephant in the China room on this is, to me, there's processes on how do we take care of our people. How do you have 1 million man or 900,000 soldier military that basically has, and I think admittedly, 20th century piece in how we manage people. So the idea of talent management is incredibly important. I am not other than just being a member of the profession, and obviously having a son that'll be a member of the profession, I'm not a stakeholder in terms of any of the mechanics of the processes that we do. But what my team has been asked to do is sort of map out who does what to who, what are the gaps, and what are recommendations for the Army to look at in order to get after a solution. I don't have the sort of capacity to do it, but we certainly, by including others in this process, can talk to the stakeholders from a non-parochial perspective, define who does what to who, look at the gaps, look at the seams, define the problem a little bit more clear, because I think a lot of people want to provide discrete solutions, and they're probably okay. There's merit to them. We have to agree on the end state, and then what are the ways, and then of course the means to achieve that. A lot of people want to say, hey, here's the way. And it's like, okay, well, that may be very good, but what's the end state that we want to achieve? So we're trying to frame that. No easy endeavor. Certainly if you got thoughts, you can send me a note, or anybody team a note. They're working through that. A couple of you guys know Andy Schaffner. He's kind of our lead on that for at least the next 6 weeks. And our goal is to provide a recommendation back to the Army leadership on not the solution, not the ways, but here's what we think the end state may be, and then here are some things to consider if you want to come after a solution. So I think with all that being said, I'm going to ask you to punch to the brain slide, if you could. Yeah. So that's kind of my wrap up. I'm really kind of open or appreciate any of your questions or comments. Thank you. Okay, comments from the Twitter sphere. Yeah, I know. I could see it. Everybody's not. They're like looking over there. I got my daughter monitoring. All right. She's got all the girls in Phi Mu sorority. They're hey, he's great. No, she's not. She's not monitoring. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I'm going My name is JJ. I'm from the UK. Thank you for that presentation. My question, I don't want to be the guy who answers semantics, but the choice of the word dominance just struck me. It's a word that focuses on a compromise, and it's the dominance of a situation and adversary. I think we've learned anything in the last 15 years is that today's adversary is the smallest partner.
Yeah.
So if we inculcate this idea of dominance over our adversaries or the situation, we're probably reducing the space for compromise and intimacy of the outcome. I'm just wondering if you can speak to why that.
Yeah, what you raise is actually been part of the dialogue, and so it's like saying win. I mean, does anybody not want to be on the winning team? Yeah, but that implies an absolute. And how do you define winning? I mean, you know that obviously we can have a tactical or operational victory and a strategic failure. So when you look at the current Army operating concept, which we put out last October, we say win in a complex world. The discussion of win, it applies an absolute, right? Just like dominance. And so we said, well, what's the next best alternative? Achieve our political ends. Okay, yeah, I got it. So I mean, you bring up a very good point. I think it's a question, and it is not semantics. It is very viable discussion. And I think that's kind of where, instead of just going with the chart, I mean, I'm also one of the Army doctrinal proponents. I'm like, hey, you got to read the book to understand it. The shortcoming of me in a briefing is it's probably it does not give the increasing depth that as you look at sort of the objectives and key tasks that lend itself to a better explanation. But I agree with you 100%. And that's why I just say, probably the discourse has got to be, we got to read the book, because that has been absolutely part of it. It becomes an absolute. But I'm not sure what and quite frankly, I will tell you, those that always have a very good perspective on it is really culturally your military. I mean, you're sort of, we talk about cultural awareness. I mean, I think the culture of many of the foreign militaries actually lends itself to sort of saying, gee, do we really realize what we're saying when we say dominance? Because that implies an absolute. I just say, I think it's our best solution to describe what we wanted to accomplish, recognizing that there are some shortcomings to it. And you got to be careful how you brief it. The safety briefing for me, from your question, is do a better job at briefing. That was good. That's a good question. Yeah.
Sir, Mike Flonowski, hopefully a SAM graduate. With the goal of creating more agile and adaptive leaders to win in a complex world, do you think our increasing capability of our mission command systems is inhibiting the process of the mission command philosophy? Yeah. Yeah.
Don, you're going to help me out on this in the next speaker. Yeah. So, I mean, again, this would take, I mean, I want to, so yes, and I could answer that probably over the course of 2 days, but what I believe is when you look at our requirements and acquisition process, as we look at how the mission command system, which is the people, the processes, the facilities, the information systems, and the network, how do they allow the warfighting function and then, of course, the philosophy to be enabled? I do agree. And quite honestly, when you look at the things that we have now, again, we should be critical of ourselves because we can always do better, but we also do pretty darn good. It is encumbering because of how we go about the requirements and acquisition process. So there is a kind of an effort going on right now to kind of work through that. I think, at least on the talent management side, I got a pretty strong belief that our former Army Undersecretary, Mr. Carson, is going to kind of take that on his new role at OSD. So there is a thing going on, the requirements thing. An example, and this is what we're moving to. I mean, it's not today. Today, the example, because I deal with capabilities, not things and widgets. So like to perform 10 functions in a command post, I got, in the analogy I use is 10 different cell phones, right? And none of them can really talk to each other. Although you can write code, right? To make different cell phones, I can make one type of cell phone talk to another. So I got 10 different cell phones to perform 10 different functions, all right? What we're moving to is a common operating environment where you only need one cell phone. Oh, wait a minute. We do that already, right? Your cell phone allows you to add and subtract the applications and the widgets that you need to perform your job, right? That's the way we're moving. And quite honestly, it's not in the distant future, it's now. So the simplicity that we have in our sort of day-to-day lives, where, I mean, probably none of us took a class on how to use a cell phone, right? I mean, or a smartphone. You just pick it up and you use it. I mean, there are some tricks. You can go to Verizon for an hour class and they'll teach you some tricks, but it's intuitive. That's the way we're going to with this sort of common operating environment. One phone, one system with a common operating environment, then you select the applications and widgets that you need that are all intuitive. It's there now. I mean, I was there up at Aberdeen Proving Ground last week. That simplifies things, because ultimately the purpose of all that stuff is what? It's to allow the commander and his teams, regardless of echelon, leaders, whomever, to understand, visualize, describe, and direct. And then, of course, lead and assess. So yes, it's too complicated. We need to make it simple, and we're moving in that direction. Yeah.
So have you found that the proliferation of monitoring or communication tools has actually reduced the efficacy of mission command? Or has the Army found ways to exploit those capabilities to further mission command? The example I'll give is, I see a lot of these, and I'll talk about this later, but a lot of these self-networked organizations developing at the grassroots level using social media, like the Bridge and other things, that are disseminating great ideas on strategy for the mission command mindset is conquer the battlefield. It's also a way for commanders to have a really insular look and direct the individual soldier at the OS-10 level.
Yeah.
How do you balance that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. There's plenty of examples where we've developed sort of flattened networks that provide success. I mean, a lot of that is within our special operations community, but then there's examples of the opposite. I mean, I remember, based on, my time in the Army, when they first, the unmanned air vehicle came out first, and everybody's like, oh, I was a much younger guy, so I was a little more cynical then. I said, oh, great. So what is my commander going to like watch everything that I do on the objective? And when my chin strap's unbuckled, I'm going to get the, hey, fix your chin strap. I've kind of concluded that as I grew up, nobody has time for that. I was introduced to something about 2 weeks ago. It is a pretty interesting idea, and I'm not 100% behind it. But basically, somebody had developed a sort of software application to determine, how do you determine the efficacy of communication, like person to person, or either phone, internet, whatever, the efficacy of communication. And so it was basically, you could wear this little monitor, and then there'd be a software program that would run in the background of your network that could measure quantitatively your sort of interactions. And then through the little monitor, somehow they had a way to look at sort of using algorithms qualitatively. And I said, well, this is pretty interesting. And I said, what this could provide me, especially as you form a team, an ad hoc team that has to come together to achieve a purpose. What it would not necessarily, I don't think it would allow you to determine in a real degree of fidelity the qualitative ability to communicate to enable sort of mission command, although they said they thought they could. What it would let you do, I think, is determine who you're not including. So if you think of yourself in sort of a multinational environment or a joint environment where you're bringing in team members from all over the place, I think unintentionally we tend to omit people. I saw this working for 2 years down at the Joint Readiness Training Center. You look and you say, why is this unit having a hard time getting this thing across? And then you sort of map it out in a human way with the observers, and you go, guess what? The commander's not talking to his intelligence officer. So his intelligence officer and his little band of gypsies of 60 people back behind the green door are doing the best they can, but the commander's not talking to them. And so you confront them with that sort of quantitative information and say, hey, look, you know why you're having a problem? You're not communicating. And so I am very leery. That's why I think, as you said in your intro, the thought of kind of coming together as people, I believe, is incredibly much more important now. Because, you know how young people talk these days. I mean, truly young people, it's not. They text. The sort of interperson dialogue gets omitted. I think it's incredibly important. And if we're not careful, we'll move in one direction. So I think we got to kind of continue to improve. Like we know that face-to-face video is an ineffective and inefficient use of bandwidth. But guess what? If you can't be in the same room together, that's the only way you gauge the human factor, you know? So I think there's importance in that. Yeah. Did that kind of get at for it, Ben?
Just came, hopefully also a Sam's graduate here. But it was interesting what you said. It's that emotional tie of the video.
Yeah.
That's what that video provides, is that not only am I hearing the person, but I'm also seeing that person. So that's important. And the cognitive dimension really, I think, gets at a lot of these things. My concern, though, is we say words like complex and we say words like adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, you know, when we say complex, we start to push away from history, I think. And we start to say that, you know, we're more complex now than we were, you know, during Caesar's time.
Yeah.
Which means that we start to say, well, it's not important to look at that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe we should relook that word to understand a little bit better what we're trying to get at. Because adaptation to me is also about how do you become a chameleon? How do you change yourself to be like them? But we can't ever be like them.
Right.
We aren't them. We're different.
Yeah.
And that's good, and we need to understand that.
Yeah.
But when I look at Francis Singa writing on Boyd,
Mm-hmm.
what he came up with was, it's not about being someone else. It's about understanding and appreciating someone else, and that gets you at how you can deal with, how you can interact with that complexity that is that human dimension. It allows you that tie with the emotion. Do you think that we're looking at the human dimension as a way to fight wars, or as a way to instruct how we educate for war?
I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, I think you bring up a couple good points. The complexity is probably relative over time. I mean, when, you know, you probably go back to, you know, what was the complexity in any sort of, well, whether it's Joshua Chamberlain or something like Kenai, or it may have been a lack of information, and certainly ambiguity and uncertainty. Now we kind of go to a certain extent in the opposite extreme, is perhaps too much. You know, Jack Nicklaus kind of talks about the paralysis of analysis when he talks about teaching golf, you know, which is something I understand pretty well. So I think the complexity remains to a certain extent relative, but based on the speed of information flow and the fact, I mean, let's say, although it could have had a loss of life historically, we should never neglect history. The outcome of that, the complexity of the outcome on the remainder of the world, either at the tactical, operational, or strategic level, was probably deferred for a period of time. But now, in the sort of real-time world that we're in, you know, you can find yourself very quickly with some sort of small-scale action or even operational level action where success or failure increase the complexity based on the outcome because of the degree of interaction. So when we look at sort of the human dimension, and then I guess what we should not, I don't want you to perceive by this is that we've been neglectful in developing individuals, peoples, or leaders over time. I think it's just one of these things where the current environment demands a much more focused effort on it. And so the individual, the soldier, and I say that, you know, it could be anybody really, as a centerpiece for development investment is sort of contrary to what I believe are sort of our military industrial complex is kind of adapted to. And again, I mean, you know, based on previous threats, perhaps you do got to have a 72-ton armored vehicle that can engage the enemy and kill them at certain distances. But I don't need a new one of those right now. Probably need a new one of those in the future. You know, we can't neglect it. For the time being, we really got to put that investment in our individuals. That's sort of the thought process is, instead of looking for the material solution out there, you know, the weapon that can shoot around corners, why don't we invest in the individual? You know, you asked a very good question. I hope that sort of gets after you. One more question. You guys want to arm wrestle for it, or you already got one? All right, we didn't get one from the back table yet, so I'm going to go with them. They were the winners. It's the prize. Yeah.
You brought up, talent management a couple times, and then you've also talked about how do we create the next, Chamberlains. And I guess my question is, more asking for your opinion. We have, I think most people like the Chamberlains, they had a huge intrinsic value system why they were doing what they were doing. Where when you look at the Army and kind of how we're the DoD in general, and how we're managing our talent, we're looking at extrinsic systems, whether it's a bonus or whether it's this or that.
Yeah.
So just to get your opinion, how do we, and whether it's our career or when we start counseling individuals or just continuing on, really develop that intrinsic value system makes them our subordinates so that they can be these critical, adaptive, and innovative thinkers?
I think you answered the question. I'd just say, I think by raising it, putting it on agreeing on a framework, putting it on the forefront of your mind and actually talking about it. And making it part of our culture as a profession that we should continue to have that dialogue with it. I think, I was having this, one of the organizations I'm fortunate enough to work with, that's under my responsibilities, the Center for Army Profession and Ethic. Now they're stationed up at West Point, but they kind of fall under us. And so we were talking yesterday, sort of the way ahead. Do you pass out fish or do you teach people to fish? And so how do you teach people to fish when it comes to the profession and the ethic? And it's really got to start. We're only responsible, obviously, for people once they come into the Army. But it has to start then. And it's got to be a consistent and persistent dialogue that can never leave. Because ultimately, when you think about as a land power, what we do, or what we must be prepared to do, which is engage in land combat and kill the enemies of our country, if asked to. Now, there's a lot of other ways to do that. You can win without fighting. You can use all sort of non-lethal means to do it. But at its most extreme end, we have to be prepared to deliver our Army forces to kill the enemies of our country. All right? So I think when you talk from a moral and ethical perspective, what is there out there that more than taking life that is worth dialogue and discussion? And so the example that we were talking about on the way when I was growing up, well, I wasn't even in the Army. My parents were at Fort Hood, Texas, and there was a guy named General Walter Ulmer, who once he retired from the Army, kind of helped establish and run the Center for Creative Leadership there in North Carolina. Really sort of one of our prevailing sort of intellectual centers for the leadership development, and not just the United States, but also the world. He had a thing that he did called What Now, Lieutenant? And it was a series of printed books that he had, on the old Xerox carbon copy books, hardbound with staples, that had a series of vignettes. And some of them, I think, were based on reality. Some that were just invented. And it provided a vignette that had sort of leadership, moral, and ethical implications behind it. And not about, which side of the hill do we attack? Moral, legal, and ethical. So you provide the vignette, let a bunch of people talk about it, think about it, and say, what are the implications for us on this, and what are viable solutions? And it wasn't necessarily about a correct answer, but it was about the dialogue that goes to an answer. And so that kind of gets in this idea of when we kind of go back, and Dr. Matthews talks about in his book, is how do you develop ways to allow people to think like that? A lot of it is through repetition, but not rote repetition, but increasing the complexity so that you continue to build sort of your repertoire of solutions. It goes back to like that platoon in Panama City. There were some platoons that had one set of solutions, and that was shoot the oncoming car because they perceived it as a threat. Another group said, well, you know what? Maybe there's a couple ways to do this. And so we'll shoot or not shoot. So I think it's not rote repetition, but substantive dialogue about these foundational ideas, and then sort of vignette-based or immersive-based or simulation-based. A great example, like in the business world, is case studies. You look at case studies, that's how you learn without sacrificing your own corporate dollars. You look at how somebody else screwed it up. let's do that morally and ethically. Wonderful question. Okay, I think we're wrapped up. Thank you all for your attention and certain dialogue. I enjoyed it. Thanks.